good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing this session on financing and investing in new housing supply. My name is Carrie Hamilton, and I'm really honored to be here. I think this is my 11th National Housing Conference, so thank you to all the organizers and sponsors. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Jurabal and Jaggeral people whose ancestors go back more than 60,000 years. And I recognize their ongoing connection to the land, the waters and community, and pay my respects to these and all First Australians, and affirm my support for constitutional recognition of this heritage and a voice to Parliament. I'd also like to acknowledge the people who bring lived experience of housing vulnerability to this conference, either as presenters or as delegates, and your voices are crucial as well. This session is being streamed. Thank you to all of our distant delegates who are joining virtually, and this will be available for delegates to view after the conference. So today, after brief presentations and a conversation that I'll facilitate between our speakers, we will be taking questions both online and from within the room. For those joining online, you'll use the Q&A tab to the right of your screen. So when we first started planning this session of financing and investing in new housing supply, we actually weren't sure if the HAF legislation would be resolved by the time of the conference. But here we are. We have quite a lot to talk about. So thank you again for joining this session. It means that we can now put behind us those 10 long, lean years when we kept having to bat down those wishful hopes you sometimes heard at these finance conference sessions, that social and affordable housing at scale could just be magicked through financing sleight of hand alone, because it can't. To develop below market, truly affordable rental housing, no amount of financing complexity can substitute for invested long-term subsidy to fund the bricks and mortar that can then be operated affordably. For example, to the 40% of our income distribution who face a shortfall of 726,000 affordable rental dwellings in Australia. So now that we have the HAF legislation, we will have this subsidy available to fill the gap between the cost to build the housing and the land and the debt that the affordable rental stream can support. Now we'll have a genuine opportunity to create fair financing partnerships between governments, nonprofits, and institutional investors like super funds for their mutual benefit. And I'd invite you to see this financing session and understand the HAF and all the other housing supports that the minister has described this morning in terms of that lens of mutual benefit. So benefits like government would prefer to input its subsidy over time rather than upfront. Like with the HAF, there will be a guaranteed minimum subsidy every year from the $10 billion that will be borrowed and then invested. But in order to secure this benefit to pay subsidy over time, think estimates hearings, for something that costs money up front in the land and construction, institutional investors like super funds can help. So what's the benefit for them? So they have a weight of defined contributions that's looking for secure investments. They can then provide that upfront capital to fund the gap in land and construction costs that has kept affordable rental from being built at scale in Australia recently. So in return, the super funds receive a benefit, a risk-adjusted return for their members, which is us, of course. So in order to receive their or our returns for the risk, in order to reduce the risk, they seek experienced counterparties who can develop and operate these affordable rental projects prudently, the community housing industry. So CHP's lean, nonprofit ethos, tenant focus, and high satisfaction ratings reduce vacancy risk and operating risk for the super funds, for us, the members. CHPs receive the benefit then, using that benefit lens, of fulfilling their organizational missions in meeting housing need and in earning development, tenancy, property management fees, which, thanks to their nonprofit status, are then invested back into affordable housing with little leakage. So these partnerships will flourish when participants all benefit fairly. So to summarize, government's benefit is meeting policy goals while contributing subsidy over time rather than upfront. Super funds invest upfront for the benefit of risk-related returns, as that investment is repaid over time by that government subsidy. And the CHP industry benefits in expanded housing mission and own equity to find the next opportunities. So these mutual benefits and motivations are at the core of what should underpin the growth of the Australian affordable housing sector in the coming years, based on all of these new mechanisms and policies, based on the HAF. And that's what our three speakers will be discussing today in this very timely session. So first, Steven Rowley of Curtin University is much more than gender diversity on the panel, I guarantee you. Now, that's his joke. That is his joke, not mine. So Steven has done important work very recently in canvassing and detailing developer activity in understanding how policy settings affect developer decisions and private sector involvement in social and affordable housing. How perfect is this? We always have to spruik our papers. I'm really glad to have Steven here. So he's here from WA. He's a professor at the School of Economics, Finance, and Property at Curtin University, and has been a director of the Ahuri Curtin Research Center since 2011, and is a member and past chair of the WA Housing Industry Forecasting Group. So we'll hear from Steven, and then we'll hear from Rebecca Oelkers, who many of you know, of course, our CEO of BHC. Many of you know Rebecca has been instrumental in building the community housing practice here in Queensland for over the past 15 years. So BHC is pioneering an early partnership in the $1 billion Queensland Housing Investment Fund, or HIF, not HAF, that's HIF, together with QIC, the Queensland Investment Corporation, and ART, the Australian Retirement Trust. BHC was also the first community housing provider to secure a credit rating and has over 1,800 homes developed under management. So Rebecca always brings a strong vision for strategic growth and deep understanding of the industry. And then we'll finally hear from Carolyn Viney, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Super Housing Partnerships, who represent the institutional investment sector and can detail what their metrics and requirements are for supporting this emerging market in Australia. Super Housing Partnerships is a specialist fund manager focused on increasing the at-scale supply of build-to-rent housing, including affordable rental housing. Carolyn is also chair of the advisory board to the Victorian Government's Office of Projects Victoria and an advisory board member of Women's Property Initiatives. And you'll find everyone's even more detailed bios in the SGCH NHC conference portal, which you've got. It's web-based this year. So these three speakers couldn't be more timely. So what we'll do to recap, each will give a brief introductory set of remarks prior to a conversation that I will facilitate between them, and then we'll, of course, open to you, both here and virtually, for questions. So first we'll hear from Steven, and then Rebecca and Carolyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. And I haven't been to Brisbane for many years, and I have to say it's changed quite dramatically. I'd been walking around the place yesterday, and I was really quite impressed. The amount of money that's actually gone into reshaping the city is just tremendous. So look, I've been an academic for a long time now, as you can probably tell. These lights are not very flattering. I think I can barely see anything. I spent the first 10 years of my career trying to convince government there was a problem, and the last 10 trying to convince them of how to deal with that solution. And I think generally, us as academics are really a little bit frustrated that we've got this continued consultation about how to reshape the housing market, how to overcome some of these issues. Well, we've been actually writing about this for 20 years. And I think the frustration is that things are just happening too slowly. We are in the middle of a crisis, and we just need things to speed up a bit. So yet more consultation around issues that we've been dealing with for many, many years is a bit frustrating. But look, I don't need to stand here and tell everybody that there's an affordability problem in this country. We know there's a housing crisis. And there are ways government could address the issue and bring down prices, but we know none of those are politically palatable. And quite frankly, you start messing with one part of the housing system, it has unintended consequences on others. It is a very, very complex system. But what I'm here to do today is talk a little bit about housing supply and how are we going to reach those 1.2 million dwellings that government has put as an aspirational target over the next 5 years. So what really stimulates private sector housing supply? Look, government is almost totally reliant on that private sector to deliver new housing. You know, if you think how little social housing we've been delivering over the last sort of 20 years or so, and you know, great to see government investing in social housing, both Commonwealth and state, but it's still, you know, a very small proportion compared to what we actually need. And the problem with the private sector is it's just not set up to deliver housing for those on low incomes. You do need subsidy. There is a minimum cost of delivering housing, and that minimum cost is still, you know, relatively unaffordable to most people on low to moderate incomes. So the 1.2 million, I mean, is there any chance of actually reaching that in the next 5 years? So basically, you require about 60,000 completions per quarter to meet that target, roughly. It's about 40,000 we're running at the moment, 40 to 50,000 over the last 3 years. But it did go as high as 60,000 at the beginning of 2007. So it can be done, but you know, that was quite a unique time. I mean, I'll take Western Australia as an example. It's the market I know best. At one point, 2014, we built 32,000 dwellings. We're down at, you know, less than half of that now. So it needs to be a very specific set of circumstances to actually deliver that type of housing supply. If we look at approvals at the moment, we're running at about 16,500 a month. Well, that was in 2010, it's about 16,500. We're down at about 13,500 now. So we're well below where we need to be. So how do we get up to a level that might get anywhere near that 1.2 million? Quite frankly, it's a very difficult problem. Look, people love to blame the planning system. It's the planning system's fault that we're not meeting our housing supply targets, and that is part of it, and I'll come back to the planning system later. But ultimately, and I've spent a lot of time talking to developers, and I certainly see a couple in this room, everyone says to me, look, the biggest driver of new supply is around market conditions. It's the ability of the developer to make a profit. Now, developers have to take on, you know, a lot of risk in order to deliver new housing supply. So they need the return to compensate for that risk, which is, you know, as it should be. You know, you're taking on risk, you need the return. And it's very much a revenue thing. So market conditions have to be such that the revenue generated from the development will outweigh the costs and leave enough to deliver a land value which will stimulate the actual sale. So if you're in a period where, you know, prices are falling, low, developers are going to pull back from that supply because they're not going to make the money from it. And we've seen a period over the last 3 years of, you know, unprecedented cost growth. Okay, so this makes development even more difficult, even less likely to go ahead outside the highest value areas where the revenues are high enough to actually compensate for the risk. So it's really about the demand side. It's about market conditions. Governments can certainly facilitate supply through, you know, reforming planning systems, making things more efficient. But by and large, it's about consumer demand. It's about the actual prices generated. And we've seen in the past that when you do get periods of increased prices, development industry does respond and development does pick up. But it's a slow process. It takes a long time to get something out of the ground. And certainly we've seen periods of boom and we've seen periods of bust. It's very easy to turn off the actual supply tap. It's a bit more difficult to turn it on. It takes time to come through. So market conditions, something completely outside of the government's control. I mean, we saw during COVID massive stimulus and we saw a massive increase in supply as a result. So it's quite easy to stimulate the demand side. It's more difficult to sort of address that and reduce affordability. So we're relying on that big increase in supply to really address affordability constraints. But the problem with supply, you know, we deliver about an extra 2% or so into stock. So supply has a limit to what it can do to affordability. At best, increasing supply would moderate price and rental growth. It's not going to make things more affordable on a dramatic scale unless there's a significant contraction in the demand side. The other barriers to housing supply, apart from the actual returns, is banks, lenders. Okay, lenders can pull back funding very quickly. Lenders is all about risk. So again, market conditions are good, banks are more willing to lend. If they're not, banks will pull back. So that can turn off, again, the tap very, very quickly. Costs, talked about the incredible price or cost growth over the last few years. So what you need is a situation where the revenue rises by more than cost, making development profitable again. And we're not going to see costs come down. Costs may grow less quickly than they have done before, but we're not going to see things get a lot cheaper over time. So it's going to take a while for development to really ramp up because the market conditions just aren't right. And then there are also capacity constraints as well. I mentioned Western Australia building 30-odd thousand dwellings a few years ago. There's no chance of that happening now. There just isn't the capacity in the industry, and it's the same for other areas as well. So government can try and support supply, and we've heard a lot about the potential support for infrastructure through planning reform. So quicker development, reducing upfront costs, yes, that's going to have a positive impact on future dwelling supply. But again, I come back to the fact that development needs to be profitable. Developers are not going to go ahead with projects unless they're going to be able to deliver a return. Again, limited amount government can do in that space. So in terms of planning, we have had those periods of very strong activity. So the planning system can increase activity, it can get approvals through, but it's not just planning. The whole development approval process is becoming increasingly complex, a myriad of other approvals that are required. It's making the developer's life harder and harder, and again, it's not really an incentive to go out there and deliver additional supply when you've got all these barriers facing you. So certainly making planning more efficient, reducing the costs of infrastructure, and even reforming the taxation side of things are going to have positive impacts on housing supply. But back to that market conditions argument again. And generally, just the operation of the industry itself is problematic. It is a profit-maximizing industry because you need to stimulate a landowner to sell. So you're always trying to maximize the revenue you can generate from your development in order to outbid your competitors. So you're not going to have a situation where developers are going to deliver at that low end. They're not going to deliver housing that's below market because you simply get outbid. You won't be generating the return required for your risk. So the whole structure of the industry is problematic in terms of delivering an affordable product. So what do we do when it comes to delivering affordable housing? And I said before, it's great to see government putting money in to social housing. I worry that it's short term. We need really 10,000 social housing units per annum in perpetuity to make any sort of dent in our affordable housing waiting lists or our social housing waiting lists. So this short-termism, I'm not convinced that when we have a change of government next, we will continue to see this significant investment in affordable housing, which is what we desperately need. So we do need the private sector to come to the party here and try and deliver an ongoing supply of affordable housing. And I think there are signs, and Susan talked a little bit this morning about Mirvac, there are signs that developers do want to get involved in the affordable housing space. It's not going to be the social housing space, it will be other products such as key worker housing, such as below market rental. And talked about build to rent and the potential. There is certainly some situations where there could be some collaboration with a community housing provider and provide an element of affordable housing. I'm a big fan of inclusionary zoning. I'm sure there are many in the room that are, and there are many in the room that aren't, but I think it's a really good way of delivering land and delivering affordable units at scale in perpetuity. But we're seeing a growth, I think, in the appetite from developers and institutions as part of the sort of ESG mandate to show that they're doing some good. And I've certainly had conversations in Western Australia, and there are lot of developers that are looking at ways that they can actually deliver affordable housing as part of their own developments. It'd be great if this happened voluntarily, but I suspect we'll have to go to the mandatory contributions, as has happened in the UK. And I started off my career looking at affordable housing contributions in the UK, the Section 106 agreements, which were producing almost 60% of the affordable housing supply at one point, very much dependent on market conditions. But it shows that this sort of thing can work if policy is properly embedded in local planning frameworks. So I think those voluntary contributions and eventually mandatory contributions will see a steadier supply of affordable product at the sort of higher end of that affordable housing range. And I'm quite confident that we will see a lot of movement in that space. And I think contribution or collaboration between the private sector and the community housing providers, and I think partnerships between government and the private sector will, I think, generate a supply of affordable housing, and hopefully on top of increasing and significant expenditure by Commonwealth and state governments, which we desperately need to increase the supply of affordable housing. So can we reach that 1.2 million aspirational housing target? I'd be very, very surprised if we can, unless there's a significant increase in demand and suddenly a rebalancing of the price costs. But government needs to continue to try and support the housing industry, because we are reliant on the private sector delivering our housing. We need more housing supply to try and slow, quite frankly, the growth of prices, and to provide more opportunities for households. Planning should be an enabler for housing supply. It shouldn't be a barrier, so there's certainly work to do there. But I keep emphasising that ultimately we are reliant on market conditions for the majority of our housing supply, and there's little government can do to change those conditions, I'm afraid. Okay, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion over the next half an hour or so.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Oelkers. I'm the CEO of Brisbane Housing Company. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on this morning, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And also for all of you non-Brisbaneites, I would like to welcome you to beautiful Brisbane. Look, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here this morning to be talking on a topic that is really close to my heart, which is the financing of and investing in new social and affordable housing. BHC is one of the largest CHPs in Queensland. We're a housing developer as well as a property manager, and we've been doing this for over 20 years. We've delivered around 2,000 units of social and affordable housing, and a little bit of market housing also, since 2002. And we typically do that in mixed tenure developments. Our smallest is around 10, our largest that we've built is around 110, and we're going up to, in our new projects, up to around the 150, even a little bit higher mark as well. So really quite some dense developments which work beautifully together. And as an organisation, we have two key strategic goals. So the first of those is to double our supply between now and 2025, so a fairly audacious goal that we have. And the second one is around supporting our residents and our communities to thrive, which is equally, if not more, important to us. And while we're here today to talk about the growth of social and affordable housing, for us, it all comes down to the why, which is providing homes for and supporting people who are in need of those homes. And I would venture to guess that for all of us CHPs in the room, that's really what we're here for. Every single day, and I think it's probably the same for the other CHPs here too, every single day we're responding to more and more people who have never thought that they were going to be homeless before, never. As well as the people who are typically on the public housing wait lists, we're also seeing the desperate plight of older women who are couch surfing, who don't know what on earth their next move is going to be, who've been priced out of a market they might have rented in for 20 years and now the owners are selling up. We're also seeing working people who are now living in their cars. And we know as BHC that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. We see so many of them, but it is just the tip of the iceberg. So for us, getting the funding solution right is much, much more than just growing the balance sheet. It's about addressing a key social problem of our times and creating an Australia where a roof over your head is an absolute given and a recognition of a fundamental human right, which I absolutely believe that it is. So acknowledging, and I think again we all probably acknowledge, and it has already been said, that there is a huge housing issue in front of us, there are 3 key points that I would like to make today before we get into the panel discussion. And those 3 points are, 1, to provide housing at scale, we absolutely need funding at scale. We can't keep on doing the same. 2, systems change is critical. And 3, we absolutely need to start sharing our learnings and not just reinvent the wheel every single time we do one of these deals. So firstly, to provide housing at scale, we need funding at scale. To put it another way, if we are really serious about meeting the scale of the demand that we have, then we absolutely have to be serious about a solution that can bring funding at scale. We can't continue to do social and affordable housing on grants, or if we were to do that, it's going to need a much greater quantum of funding from governments. And I think there just needs to be a recognition that we need to bring other sources of capital to the table. This is fundamental if we are serious about actually getting to the root of this problem. I think we also agree that the demand for social and affordable housing is so great that no one single player is the panacea or the solution for this problem. It's not government, it's not institutional investors, it's not CHPs, it's not the private sector. We all have to work together to meet this challenge that we have in front of us. Unmet housing need is huge. It has been said this morning that that's ballooning out to 940,000 homes of unmet need by 2040 if we don't start to stem that demand. And specifically, just bringing that back to Queensland, UNSW recently found in a report for QCOS that we actually need 11,000 new social and affordable homes to be delivered each and every year for the next 20 years in Queensland alone if we are to look at meeting the backlog in demand and also addressing the emerging need that's coming forward. That is really huge when you look at it in the context of what it is that we're planning for with the Housing Australia Future Fund. 11,000 every single year in Queensland alone is what is required. Further, the South East Queensland regional plan that has just come forward also substantiates that by saying that they are really trying to target 7,200 just for the South East corner alone. So these numbers are huge numbers, and we need an at-scale solution to actually be dealing with them. And look, I want to applaud government because I actually think, and I've been in this sector for around 20 years now, I think that all levels of government are absolutely now trying to pull the levers that they have. Local, state and federal are all really getting behind this, and that is hugely important. I would like to give a really big shout out to the Queensland State Government, who absolutely has shown leadership in this sphere. The introduction of the Housing Investment Fund is kind of the precursor to the HAF, and I think that we are really showing the way and leading the way in Queensland with regard to how institutional investment can be brought to the table. So I really will applaud the Queensland State Government for that. Under the HIF, and this is the thing that our team has been working on for a long time, probably 18 months now, and I'm definitely greyer than I was at the beginning of it. We've been forming a consortium with our partner, Queensland Investment Corporation, and that partnership is to provide 1,200 new social and affordable dwellings built between now and 2025, or commenced between now and 2025. These are going to be funded by NIFIC as the senior debt. The sub-debt will be through the Australian Retirement Trust, or ART, and it will be topped up and supported by the Housing Investment Fund with a subsidy payment on a yearly basis. And whilst this is great, it's groundbreaking, it's institutional investment being brought to the table, we know that this is just one deal and that there need to be so many more of these deals done right across Australia. We know that, and I'm sure that Carolyn will absolutely speak to this, that there is such interest from institutional investors right across Australia, just like ART, to get activated in the social and affordable housing space, and that these deals are starting to be done right across the country. So BHC is not the only one doing it, there's many others that are doing it. Institutional investment using both Australian capital and overseas capital needs, though, to be activated at scale. The institutional investors don't do small deals, they need to do large deals. So either we need to do large deals or aggregate the funds so that we can do smaller, but typically they need to do the larger deals. And these investors need to understand and be comfortable with the roles and the parties and the risk allocations in the deal, so that what we have is more of a plug-and-play type mentality. And by this, what I mean is that all of the parties understand what their roles are, they understand what the deal is, they understand that the risk allocations are going to work for them, and that we can do these kinds of deals day in, day out, today, tomorrow, and right into the future. It can't be something that's an anomaly, it's got to be something that is very well understood and that the risk allocations are very well understood. I think also really importantly, it's got to be something where those risk allocations are actually positive for the parties that are involved and that the risks are taken where they are appropriately needed to be taken. We also really need to understand that the super funds have a fiduciary duty to their superannuants. These aren't philanthropic deals, they are commercial risk-adjusted return deals, and that's very important for us and for governments to understand as well. Bringing this huge capital source to the table means that the government funding that is available is going to be able to go a lot further. And I think that is hugely important, that we're leveraging our government funding to the best of our abilities, and that those funds will be used more as a top-up rather than the full capital stack itself. Very, very important. So to my second point, systems change is critical. With this huge potential and interest from the institutional partners, we've got a real responsibility to redesign the systems that we have around social and affordable housing funding so that we've got frameworks that work, absolutely work. We need to ensure that those frameworks can be leveraged and layered, as I said before, across federal, state and local initiatives, and that debt and equity partners can nicely sort of slipstream into that it's not clunky. At the moment, I think it is still a little bit clunky. It's probably easier just to deal with one level of government than to try to streamline and use all. But we all know that getting social and affordable housing off the ground kind of takes a bit of a lasagna approach. You need to layer things in. So we need to make that as streamlined as we possibly can. And coordination is crucial. I think we also very much need to collectively insist upon and advocate for government processes that are going to be as efficient in the assessment and the contracting process as we possibly can get. If you've got procurement processes that are really difficult, lots of hoops to jump through, all it means is that it's time-consuming, costly, and I believe unnecessarily competitive. So we've got to be speedy and nimble with our approaches if we want to really get to the goals that we're setting. And at the end of the day, we need a system that allows for local innovation and vision, empowers and strengthens our community housing sector, focuses every dollar on the contribution towards maximising the housing outcomes, not just legal fees and bid resourcing, and brings those homes to fruition in our communities and for people as quickly as they possibly can be. So lastly, to my third point, we need to share our learnings and not reinvent the wheel. And I feel very, very passionately about this, I have to be honest. And it's a little bit ironic because the deal we're doing is still commercial in confidence. And I can't talk in great deal about it as yet, but it is my absolute hope that we will be able to speak about this deal and that we all will be able to speak about our deals. Because what I mean by this is that now is the time for a new collective confidence in partnering to deliver these homes. We've got big goals. We can't just be in our own little silos, getting on and doing our own little deals. We've got to actually have that collective confidence. And that includes things like sharing information and IP about how our deals are structured. And I really do think this sounds a little bit foreign to a lot of us, but it is important that we do that, and I think we must do it. We can't be reinventing the wheel each time a new financial partnership is made. It is just simply too time-consuming and too costly. Early deals like ours, they've started with an absolutely blank page, and that's been great, but we've had to work out the roles, the risk allocations, and all of the underpinning documentation. And what I believe is that we need to take the early learnings of the deals, not just BHCs, but the deals that are being done right across Australia, and write a playbook of how to structure these deals so that each party brings its strengths to the table, it takes risks where they are appropriate, and are also confident, though, that they will be able to be protected and that the homes that will be built can remain in perpetuity. And I personally do believe it's very important that these homes are in perpetuity. Most will say, yep, they want to have their models replicated, but honestly, without being able to share real information that others can use about risk allocations, pricings, things that have gone wrong, challenges, and the ways that we've managed them, I honestly don't see how we're really going to get to grips with it. So that's my absolute feeling. We've got to get better at sharing our IP. So in closing, I just want to say that we're all here today at this conference because no matter what our role, we absolutely want to contribute to better housing outcomes for Australians. Our communities and those people that walk through our door each and every day are looking at us with some hope for their housing futures, and they're relying on us to get these conversations right. And I honestly do believe that we can get these conversations right, that we can bring superannuation funding and other innovative forms of funding to the table. And I'm really looking forward to the future where we can all do this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I do want to say, as we move through my comments, that we did not get together and exchange notes before this. We actually prepared our presentations very separately, but there's lots in common, including some of the language, which I am amazed by, that from Brisbane to Melbourne to Perth and other places, there's lots of people thinking about the same things. I'm Carolyn Viney, I'm the CEO of Super Housing Partnerships. I too will begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And come Saturday, I will be voting yes, respecting the right of everyone to make their own choice on the voice. Super Housing Partnerships, or SHP, is about a year old, and for the vast majority of you in the room, you will have never have heard of us. We are a specialist investment manager which is focused on creating investment opportunities for large institutional investors in low to middle income housing, including social and affordable housing. Our name, Super Housing Partnership, as suggests, is a core part of our thesis that by partnering with a range of different groups, we can do more together than trying to do it all on our own. So under our model, we partner with private investors like the superannuation funds. We've just closed our first project with the support of HESTA in Melbourne, ANZ and Treasury Corporation of Victoria, 362 apartments, 20% social, 20% affordable, about 5% rather specialist disability, and the balance at market housing being delivered on a mixed tenure blind basis. We partner with lots of different developers in lots of different locations, and we partner with the community housing providers, including most notably Housing Choices Australia, which is the foundation partner we have for that project in Melbourne and 4 other projects we're delivering with HESTA. Our partnering-centric approach at SHP is partly why we say it takes a village to raise a village, and that it's by working together with other groups that we can do that. But also because, leaving aside SHP's preferred partnering approach, we fully embrace that it will take many different market participants approaching things in lots of different ways in order to sustainably solve our current housing challenges. There's a place for all of these parties and all of these different approaches. Beginning with private capital investment in housing, which again is something that Rebecca spoke about, sustainable, large-scale, long-term, repeat, ongoing solutions for social and affordable housing rely on the participation of private capital. And SHP has been created as a vehicle which is specifically designed to enable the super funds and other large institutional investors to have access to those investment opportunities. There is demand from those type of investors for housing in Australia, including social and affordable housing. Their requirements and the characteristics for their investments are relatively unique, and our platform is designed to bridge the gap or put the glue between the pieces, whatever analogy we want to use, to enable them to have access. The sheer volume of housing required makes private investment essential. I think we all know that. And it's quite simply beyond the capacity of governments to try and solve these issues on their own. We know that housing affordability is a global trend and a trend that is set to continue. In overseas housing markets, we know that we see large-scale institutional investment in housing comprising a very meaningful proportion of the total homes delivered in those markets every year. And in those markets, we also see a range of policy settings and government incentives to ensure that the housing that is delivered includes a big proportion of social and affordable housing, not just high-end premium apartments, which is what has proliferated our private housing market in recent times, including, I will say, in the emerging build-to-rent space. We also see that housing delivered in locations near jobs and near infrastructure where people actually want to live, and government policy settings are incredibly important in that context. So long-term, ongoing and sustainable solutions to housing will mean we need to be doing new things that we haven't done before, or at least haven't done before at scale. Taking some of those pilot projects and experiments and other ideas that other people have been able to break ground on and working out how we scale those things up. Scaling up delivery of new build-to-rent homes, scaling up private investment in housing, and accepting that super funds and other private investors will need to earn a commercial return if we want them to keep coming back again and again and again and again and doing more and more and more of it. But as well as doing these new things, it also means we need to keep doing everything that we've done historically. Private developers need to develop and build to sell homes. Government needs to continue to invest in social and affordable housing. The super funds and others coming along is not going to replace that. We need to ensure they have those right policy settings in place, including the levers that enable those investors to come into markets and continue to invest. And we need to embrace and grow the role of the community housing sector as an essential part of the successful delivery and management of these assets on completion. So we need the old approaches, and we need the new approaches, and we need the approaches that we haven't even thought of yet. It's an and, not an or a more is more in the current context. One of the solutions is the participation, as we've said, by large private investors, including the super funds. And as I've said already, SHP was created and specifically designed to enable that to happen. The Australian superannuation funds currently control $3.4 trillion worth of investment, making Australia the 5th largest pension system in the world, and forecast to triple to $9 trillion by 2041. Just a modest percentage of that allocation into new housing in Australia is a massive number of homes. The emergence of Build-to-Rent Australia is a key part of enabling the super funds and other institutional capital. It's a model under which they can invest at scale and on an ongoing basis, and it's both those two factors that are critical to enable the programmatic deployment of capital from these types of investors. And it's frankly why we haven't seen the super funds invest in housing here previously, in preference to investing in overseas markets, ignoring their own home markets. Historically, there hasn't been a model under which they can invest until relatively recently, and we have that now. So we shouldn't underestimate the role of build to rent. It's not a complete solution, but it is part of a solution for enabling this kind of very large-scale repeat investment. And it's not just the super funds, it's the other large domestic and global investors as well. And BTR opens the door to both. I mentioned that partnering is a core part of who SHP is and what we do. SHP is very consciously not a developer. In fact, we're different from many of the other BTR players because a key part of our thesis is that we don't actually need to be a developer in order to deliver homes. And a better solution for us is to partner with the developers who are already really well credentialed and already out there. There are lots of great residential developers right across the country. They know how to source sites, how to procure DAs, how to work well in appointing a builder, and how to make sure the builder is delivered really, really well. And we don't want to replicate this. What we want to do and what we need to do is leverage as much of the existing housing ecosystem as we can, putting it to work rather than reinventing the wheel or replicating what already exists. It enables us to invest in projects in lots of different geographies beyond the reach of any one development firm. It also enables us to create investment opportunities across different housing types, apartments, house and land, in cities, in regions, and most importantly, it enables us to invest at scale in a much larger number of projects each and every year and deliver more homes as a result. So SHP adopts a partnering approach to enable large-scale investors to have access to large-scale project opportunities on a repeat and ongoing programmatic basis. But our approach is our approach. It isn't the approach. It will be one of many, because our true belief is it will take a village to raise a village, but we're happy to be part of that village. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our three panelists. I really appreciated all of your presentations. I'm just going to ask a few questions for a conversation, then we'll turn to the audience. First of all, before we have had this new introduced legislation of the HAF, we've seen private investors, developers, super funds already participating in key worker housing, and that was rental development set only 25% below soaring market rents. How viable are privately financed projects that include deeper rental affordability, including social housing? Now, Steven, you've done a lot of work on developer motivations, and Carolyn, you were past development head and CEO at Grocon Group, who many of us know delivered the Common Ground projects in both Melbourne and Sydney. That are aimed at formerly homeless Australians. So what appetite is there for private delivery of deeply affordable rental housing?
From a private sector perspective, I think we need to talk about risk, and we've heard risk mentioned a lot so far today, and it's very important. And I think the deeper the subsidy from a private sector developer's point of view, the deeper the risk. There's a reputational risk in there. There's still a stigma attached to things like social housing and the perception of tenant quality and so forth. So I think things like key worker housing, where there is less risk perceived from the tenant side of things, are a lot more palatable for private sector developers. They require less risk, and Susan mentioned the example this morning of the Mirvac development. So I think if you're looking at trying to get significant contributions from private sector developments towards affordable housing, it would be at that sort of level that requires less of a subsidy, a tenant that's say more palatable from a private sector perspective. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. When it comes to deep subsidies, social housing and so forth, I think we need to look at the community housing provider sector as well as direct spend for government, and perhaps think of ways in which partnerships with the private sector involve as little risk for the private sector as possible.
Perceived risk.
Perceived risk.
Versus real risk is something I'd introduce. Carolyn, would you agree, or do you have a different view?
Look, no one wants to hear us agree on everything. So I'm going to disagree. I am going to say that I think when investors think about where they want to place their money, they're very focused on risk and reward and how much risk are they taking to chase a return. And the classic case that we've seen in build to rent is lots of premium build to rent going on where people are sort of back solving to a return they need. But as a result of that, they're playing in a relatively small part of the market with very high rents and generally lots of escalation built in. So there's a risk profile associated with that relative to social housing, which from an investor point of view, we would say on the raw numbers is effectively Commonwealth government-backed housing, because the tenant is effectively using Commonwealth money or a big proportion of Commonwealth money in their overall income to pay their rent. And the risk profile around that is generally not discretionary, and unless we're talking about the Commonwealth government failing anytime soon, there's sort of almost a quasi-underwriter where that income is coming from. So when we think about the returns that an investor is taking, they're consciously looking at what is that risk profile and where do they want to play. I don't suggest that for a moment that all social tenants are going to be easy to manage, but I do think that the way we think about the cohort of residents in a building, what services we put around them, makes it manageable and deals with some of that reputational risk that I think has been perceived in that cohort before. I do think also that there's just an absence of true understanding of what makes up the length and breadth of a social tenant. So I'm more optimistic that we can get our head around what that might look like over time. We're in a fledgling kind of industry, and I'm careful I'm talking about build-to-rent being emerging, because the CHPs are the original build-to-rent in this country, albeit for a particular part of the market, and we're expanding that. So I'm hoping that that cross-pollination of ideas and management methodologies, and certainly on the mixed tenure, tenure-blind approach we're adopting, it's effectively a joint venture between Housing Choices Australia and the at-market manager of that building to curate one cohort of residents in the building, not three separate cohorts between social, affordable and market.
That's helpful. So, you know, Steven describing maybe where we've been, and Carolyn optimistically looking forward. And Rebecca, do you think the community housing sector, you know, has done its job in explaining how it mitigates risk rather than adds risk as an unknown? Or how would you like to go forward in the sector?
I think that it comes down to a relationship between the CHP and the institutional investor as a funder, and them understanding the CHP that they are dealing with, understanding their business model, and therefore also understanding a little bit more about the sector as well. Because there is definitely that predisposition to think negatively about social housing, but it is not a founded risk. The way that these tenancies are managed is very, very positive. And when a superannuation fund looks at the kind of statistics and the KPIs that we have in terms of vacancies and arrears and management, it's very stark that these are managed well. I was very interested, and I think the point that you make is true, that developers have a concern about social housing, but it is not a founded risk necessarily, and I do not believe that it is. When we actually were working with ART, it was quite interesting to me that some of the things that you were saying, Carolyn, are absolutely true, that they were really more interested in what was backing the incomes, and it's Commonwealth Bank backed. So there's CRA and there's pensions or benefits that are really from the government. And so also they were looking at the demand for the housing, whereas affordable housing, I thought that affordable housing would be something that they would be slightly more interested in. In actual fact, social housing was the segment that they were most interested in. And in some of the developments that we've put forward under our QIC BHC initiative, there's a small component of market housing. The super funds are not so interested in funding the market housing because of the demand profile. And even though there is a huge demand currently, the greatest demand and the greatest certainty long term is with the social housing. So to answer your question, I think it comes down to us really giving that sense of the security of the CHP sector, the fact that we do manage our properties very well, the fact that the tenants are good tenants, and that they pay their rents, and that there aren't arrears, and that this is a safe, low-risk kind of investment.
I agree that, you know, I've always said that the real risk in the risk profile, the counterparty risk, is not so much the community housing provider, it's the Australian government on whose subsidy flow the risk return metrics are calculated. So it's the administration, and it's the potential change in government, So look, I'd love to talk about the half now. That's a perfect transition. It's too early to have a lot of details, but how would each of you like to see it work? Administered, allocated, enacted, by whom and how? Really the question is, what is required for the half to truly unlock institutional investment, Carolyn, and nonprofit, Rebecca, and for-profit, Steven's research, developer activity without attracting excessive risk premiums, without having a lot of new market extra cost? How do you want to see it work?
Look, I think in some ways it's not dissimilar to the observations that have been offered about town planning, which I know we've spent some time on already today, but most investors and developers are a form of investor. If they know what the rules are, and the rules are going to be consistently applied, then they're generally pretty good at navigating and finding a way to fit within the the rules that have been set. So if there's clarity around what the focus is, how applications are going to be assessed, you know, at the 11 out of 10 category, if there's template documents that don't need to be negotiated from scratch each and every time, and people are able to take away both the time value of working on, let's call it a deal, if we want to be crude, is going to take 9 months or 3 months or 60 days. All that sort of stuff factors into an investor's thinking. So again, at the very large scale institutional capital end of the spectrum, and HAF's going to, you know, deal between, you know, small to big. But I think the thing that both parts of that spectrum have in common is everyone just wants to get investment into housing, and the quicker and simpler ways that we can set up a framework that enables people to understand what to do and when to do it, the easier and more efficient it will be for everyone, including Housing Australia or NIFIC itself. It's only got so many people sitting at the desk waiting for these applications. Are they going to deal with it by touching it 100 times or touching it 5 times? There's a pretty simple answer to what that needs to look like. We just need to make it easier.
And I think for the not-for-profit sector, it is exactly the same. Everything you've said applies. I would hope that there is going to be some grant funding that comes from this, that it's not all availability payments or top-up subsidies. But what I would say is that I think it's really important that there are a few key models that are put out, not kind of a plethora of different things. I think we have to come down on some key models and really roll those out in a way that is able to be done day in, day out and continuously. And to get to that point, look, and I do think there's still going to be a role for grants, although I don't think we would, if the whole of the HAF was going to be put out in grant funding, we're never going to make the targets that we need to make. So I would probably err on the side of more of it being availability subsidies and actually institutional investment being leveraged. But certainty is absolutely the key. It is certainty. We can't have something that can be chopped and changed with the whim of government. It's got to be something that is set in motion and that institutional investors can rely on for, say, a 20-year period. The deal that we've got with QRC together under the HIF is a 20-year deal, and that superannuation fund ART knows that there is certainty in those returns for that 20-year period, and that is absolutely crucial. Super funds are not going to be interested in housing, and they're not going to be interested in the not-for-profit sector and social and affordable housing if there's vagaries around political interventions, and it is incredibly important that that is understood and locked down. You know, look, I also think the point that I made before around the contracting, and you've just made it as well, we've got to be able to do these things quickly. The deal we've just been doing has been around 18 months and we're still not quite finished. We can't have the deals take that long each and every time. So having some pro formas where you've got the actual risk allocations broadly established so that we know what risks government should take, we know what risks the developer should take and the tenancy manager and what the institutional investor should take. And we know how to hedge any risks that are in there, and we know which parties do these things. If we can have a broad play sheet of those and then just negotiate around the edges, that's the way I believe we're going to get to these deals quickly, and we can do them, many, many of them.
Yeah, I think that certainty is the key issue, really. That's all the sector wants, I think, is to know where it's going to be the next year in 10 years' time and to have, you know, a consistent source of funding and support. But going back to planning, it was mentioned that, you know, and it's right, that developers will work through the planning system if there's money to be made out of a scheme. Planning is a pain, yes, and everybody knows that, but developers will work their way through it. But I think when people talk about planning reform, what developers want is opportunities. They want more opportunities to be able to go out and deliver and make money. So we hear an awful lot about planning reform, about the problems and so forth, but really what we need from planning reform is further opportunities for developers to deliver housing. And again, it comes back to that certainty, reducing planning risk by ensuring you've got a way of navigating that process in a timely manner. So I think the whole thing about development and about investment and so forth is about certainty.
I agree. I think it pays to recall during the NRAS, that wonderful program, after the Queensland floods. here in southeast Queensland. You know, the government at the time was going to cut those incentives from 50,000 down to 35,000 to divert some funding for flood restoration. That spooked the market.
Yes.
Okay, so it's important that, and you know, we all flew to Canberra, we sat down with, it was Tony Burke at that time, you know, when we were having several ministers in a row, but so certainty, consistency, and you know, all being on the same page, no matter what sector, you know, we come from. So, I mean, that leads on to my next question, you know, is this time going to be it? We know what happened with NRAS. It did not survive a change of government unfairly. And it did not unlock institutional capital because there was that uncertainty introduced over its cross-party support. So will we now with the HAF be able to develop a set and forget mechanism? I like your phrasing, our plug and play partnership model that becomes standardized for producing affordable rental housing at scale consistently. So what key approaches do each of you think will it take to mature the market so that the HAF can endure across change in government, that it's too important to fiddle with across changes? What settings and backing will it take?
I think we got to a stage now where housing is so politically important. It would be a very brave government that decides to wind back anything that's delivering a supply of affordable housing. So that's my hope now, that you know we've got a very vocal support for housing initiatives, be it from the Greens or being in state level, or whatever, and hopefully that will carry us through with some certainty going forward.
I have never, in all of the years that I've worked in housing, seen so much just public support, because people are realising it's their mother, it's their sister, it's their brother, it's their son that's being affected, and it's no longer something that is a marginal issue, which I think previously it's never been a marginal issue, it's always been an important issue, but now people are kind of seeing it as much more of an issue, and that's good and it's bad. It's good in that it's getting that recognition and that political clout. It's bad that it's taken it to get to this point that we've needed it. So I feel, you know, sad about that and all of the advocacy that we've done over the years. But it's good that we're at this point, and I agree with you that I don't think it's going to go backwards. So I think the answer is yes. I think that the fact that we've got Housing Australia is a very, very positive thing, and the fact that this investment is there, the 10 billion that has then been augmented and can be augmented again. This is just the start. This is absolutely just the start. And I know I'm a very optimistic person, but I honestly do think it's going to be extremely hard to wind back. And I think, as we've seen in other countries around the world, you can get something like this started, and once those first deals get done and there starts to become a normality to the deals, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I really want a piece of that. I want a piece of that, and I can see how it stacks up for me. It works for all of the parties, and it's going to get that momentum. And I think it is going to get much more momentum than, for instance, NRAS, which I also agree was such a catastrophe that that's not been, you know, refunded, but nonetheless. But this is different because we're talking institutional investment rather than mum and dad investors. So I think that there really is that opportunity, and I'm very positive about it.
I'm going to agree with both the comments that have been made, and I'm going to take it just one step further, because I think it's all of that, but I think it's also, as well as the mainstream appreciation that both social housing and affordable housing is not some marginalised group of people who we've never met before and who we don't know. We've now got lots of people who we know, whether they're young people, old people, in-between people, who are being crunched by our housing system. So there's that proximity of relationship which I think helps people understand more. But I think the other thing, again, I'll put my investor hat on, a lot of these investors have already got very large investments in assets right around the country. So whether it's an airport, a hospital, or something else, they're thinking, all these things that require physical labour to operate these assets, what happens if those things can't be staffed? Because where we've sent those people to live without intervention is miles and miles and miles away. So they're not actually going to drive or catch the train an hour and a half to get to that work destination anymore. For 26 bucks an hour, they're going to work at that thing that's round the corner, and the asset that you've already got billions of dollars of exposure to, that you paid a lot of money for 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whenever it is, its value will be eroded by the fact that it cannot be staffed. So when you're thinking sort of holistically around where are the impacts being felt, for those asset values, there is a concentration by some investors in what does that look like for them. And does having a whole heap of nursing accommodation near the hospital or otherwise affordable and social housing in those locations, is that a means of making sure that the economic productivity of that asset is maintained quite separately from providing good housing for people who deserve it, which is a separate consideration.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
not an eloquent way of expressing that, but you get the drift.
I think that's very true.
I'd love to turn it over to our audience present and online, and it's very tricky for me to see over the lights. I wonder if the lights could come up in the rest of the room. I see a very yellow question up there, but it's really hard to see. Now, I'm not sure if we have a roving mic, so if you might want to try to stand up. Oh, there is one. Thank you very much. Now, if you are online, I'd like to remind you, please use the Q&A tab that should be to the right of your screen. Thank you.
Hi. That's, yes, working. Claire Richards from Mount Alexander Shire Council in Central Victoria, very regional rural council. Question about involvement of the large-scale investors, I guess particularly for Carol. What are your thoughts about whether government can play a role to make fund aggregation work for rural to peri-regional settings? And what would it take? What are the policy settings? What are the potential investments from government that would make it work?
Yeah.
Because otherwise we are even further marginalised than we are at present.
Yeah, so the way I think about what we're doing is trying to have all the players in the ecosystem do what they would do normally, and then focus on, call it those market normal settings, but then filling in the gaps where we need the gaps. And Rebecca, I think, used the expression of saying, you know, if there is going to be government subsidy or grant or availability payment, it needs to be at a lower level than traditionally would have been contemplated, and it needs to do a really good job of leveraging that private investment that's coming from elsewhere. So when we think about what government does to enable investment in a regional area versus metro versus an apartment versus house and land, I think there are nuances in all of that. But I do think when we think about sort of spheres of investment, we think about high density metro, we think about house and land, family size homes in the suburbs, and we think about the regions, absolutely, and it will be all three eventually. I think the bit that is a slight competitive disadvantage for the regions right now is, one, getting labour into the regions to build some of this stuff is challenging, and to the extent that there are investors who are up and about wanting to deploy capital, getting it into an apartment setting where they actually understand the macros of those markets and there's lots of rental evidence, etc., is kind of an easier space for them to start. So I don't say they're going to start and finish there. I think it will flow right through. But let's get them started in a place where we think we can get going successfully and then expand into there. So, yeah.
Can I just add to that as well? I think it's true to say that it is very doable to have institutional investment in the regions, and certainly in our HIF bid we have some regional developments, and we are going to be looking at doing further regional developments. When you look at the feasibilities that sort of sit behind, sometimes it might mean that the government subsidy needs to be slightly deeper subsidy, but that's okay, that's part and parcel of it. From the institutional investors' point of view, they're a little bit agnostic as long as they get the return that they're requiring, and as long as those KPIs that underpin it, you know, the demand, for instance, and, you know, the vacancies and the arrears and all of those kinds of things that underpin the model are secure, then as long as they get their return, they're a little agnostic. So sometimes the government subsidy may need to just be a slight bit bigger, But that's okay, because government subsidy, it's still a more efficient way for government to deploy its funds than doing a pure grant-funded model.
Yep, 100%.
Thank you. We have a related question online. Worried that the HAF is likely to be complex with high transaction costs for CHPs. What advice to a diverse range of CHPs? You identified regional, those who may or may not have engaged in a lot of complex financial arrangements. What advice would you have how to access and deploy funding while protecting long-term risk exposure?
Can you say it again? Sorry, Carrie.
No
I
worries.
can't
I know it's
hear
very
so well
difficult
from
to
here.
You're up the front. It's
Yeah.
about how CHPs can protect long-term risk exposure bidding for a new financial structure.
Look, I think it's very important that CHPs go into this with their eyes wide open, and that CHPs understand the kind of risks that they are willing to take and the kind of risks that they are not willing to take. And for instance, things like, understanding a whole heap of different things around the nuances of a deal. So for instance, if you're the developer, if you're a CHP and you're a developer and there's going to be material cost overruns, who bears that risk? Who bears that risk? You can't sign up to something and then sort of find out down the track, oh God, we bear that risk. And all of a sudden we can't get trades and the building price has gone right up and oh my goodness, and then you're sort of screwed. So you've really, really got to understand and go into a lot of detail in terms of understanding all of those nuances, and that sort of is the process that you go through from you sort of start with your key commercial terms, which are the key commercials of the deal, where you kind of almost are doing a bit of speed dating and saying, well, these are the kinds of things that we think are important. Super funder, these are the kinds of things you think are important? And they'll say yes, or actually no, we're not aligned. You've got to have that alignment first and foremostly, and then actually get into more and more detail about the things that you can take risks on and the things that you cannot take risks on. So for instance, material cost overruns, CHP can't be up for that. At the end of the day, it's not going to work. And then there's a whole raft of other things. So it's just really being sure about those. And that's where I come to this idea of having a playbook, of kind of actually having some of these things already set out so you don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch, because it is time consuming, but it is very, very well worth it if we can get to that position eventually.
The other thing which I might add to that is, when I think about our book, a whole bunch of projects, 10 that are sort of confirmed in planning and in delivery, and a whole range of other third-party developer conversations we're having. Across that spectrum of projects, the risk profile in each, they're not all fundamentally different, but consciously made decisions as to where are we prepared to take an overrun risk, or where is the investor prepared to take overrun risk, and where are we via a partner taking a fully wrapped solution.
Yes.
Which for different investors, they'll want different things at different points in time, depending on what their risk and reward appetite is. And I fundamentally don't think the CHPs are going to be any different than that. You won't want, I expect, all of one thing or all of the other. It will end up being a blend, depending on your balance sheet and your servicing cost and all that stuff. But it's sort of the same kind of parameters. And I guess by extension of that, what I would say is there will be times when it makes sense for a CHP to seek that partner to take some of that risk for it. It might have different appetite to do so that's actually more appropriate for that point in time.
And also, you might not want the risk, but if you need to take that risk, you can price it in.
Thank you very much. We had a question over here.
Andrew Elving, Coaster Bay Housing Group. We're on the Sunshine Coast. I think this issue about regional issue, just picking up on that, is a very important thing, because all the models we see at the moment are largely metro-based. To do multi-res apartments of 150 on the Sunshine Coast is just a no-go even for the private sector, let alone a CHP leading it. And I'm concerned that setting of the HAF, for example, they're starting off say it's got to be a minimum of 50. That's just going to be a killer for regional areas. So I also think the built form is very important, because there is a way in which you can do density very well in the regions on medium density sites with very clever design, more European. It seems to me that there are significant barriers in regional areas that like mine have enormous pressure in the housing market that actually need to be thought about right from the off, because we just can't deliver metro models, and I'm very concerned that we'll be forced into that, you know, if we want to participate. So I think this is a good discussion. I agree with everything on the panel, but I think more commentary about the built form, you know, community acceptance, scale. It has to be lower scale. How do we aggregate that in a regional setting so that we can get this right from the start? Because we can't wait 5 years for all those questions to be answered before the investment comes our way. So some commentary about that, please.
No, I really agree with you, Andrew. I absolutely agree. And you guys have got some excellent models that are more those townhouse style models and smaller. They absolutely should be things that are acceptable, and that built form is very, very important. Probably the same point that you were making, Claire, around the regions. I think it would be very problematic if there were to be certain numbers that were said, well, it's got to be, more than 50. That isn't going to work in all of the areas. And I don't think that that's necessarily what super funds are going to want either. I don't think the size necessarily matters. As I said before, the depth of the subsidy might need to be slightly more to facilitate those developments, but that should be absolutely fine. And I think that there should be some quotas around making sure that we get proper distribution of these properties, metro and regional.
Yeah, and I think from our point of view, where scale and the scale of the investment is an issue for us due to the nature of our client. But we think about that because, as Rebecca said, we're not interested in having too many of anything in one location and it being oversupplied. That's sort of a bit horrific for everyone involved. But the idea of being able to bundle a portfolio where you get to some sort of critical mass, whether it's 50 or 100 or whatever, across regional areas is something that we're definitely thinking about.
We had a question up here, I think. Sorry, just down here in the middle. Thank you.
What an informative panel discussion it was. So thank you very much, Carol, Rebecca and Steve. That's been terrific. My name's Donna and I'm the CEO of a youth homelessness organisation in Melbourne. And we have, the last census data told us that 25% of Victorians who are homeless are young people. It also tells us that only 0.4% of young people on Centrelink incomes were able to access public or social housing. So that's a pretty deplorable situation, and from my perspective, I feel as though social housing has failed one of the most vulnerable groups in our community, and that is young people who are homeless. I'd like to have some discussion about a funding model, a financial model that works in social housing for young people, and one in which it's not about the level of, I think the rent needs to be based on a percentage of their income, 20% of their income, 25% at the most, rather than looking at a particular level of rent in the market, because otherwise young people may spend most of their Centrelink income on their rent and not be able to live their life. So I think it's really disappointing from my perspective and our organisation that for 20 years young people have been severely neglected in this space, and I think it's about time that we started to talk about how we're going to address this situation. To me, the risk is young people. The risk is young people. If young people don't have stable and safe housing, what's going to happen is we're going to see them turn up at hospitals, mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, disengagement from school. That's the risk. The young people, their lives, their futures are at risk. And the cost, the rippling effect of that in our community is huge. We can stop that, and now's the time to ensure that they're included in this debate.
Thank you, Donna. Well, youth homeless... Thank you, Donna. So will youth homelessness be able to be incorporated in the HAF, or do you think that would be elsewhere in the partnership agreement best funded and provided?
Well, can I just say, I absolutely agree with you, Donna. Was it Donna? Yep. I absolutely agree with you. At BHC, we realise this as well, and we actually have a partnership with Brisbane Youth Service. And in we've done a very modest amount of specifically youth housing previously, because of the points that you very eloquently raised. They just, social housing doesn't work for so many young people, and they're really just barred from it. So when we did the youth housing that we have done previously, we really just had to say it's going to be 25% of their income. It's a very small income. It's going to be a very small rent, but you can cross-subsidise it in a larger building. And so we dipped our toe in the water with that, and now under our HIF bid, the Housing Investment Fund bid, we've got a quota of youth housing. It's not a huge quota, but it is a start, and we want to increase that because we've got a real commitment to young people and the fact that it just is not working in social housing for them. And I totally agree with you that they've got so few, opportunities, so few opportunities. But in my mind, mechanisms like the HIF or the HAF, you absolutely can do it. It's up to the provider that is putting forward the bid, because it just means that, again, the subsidy will need to be slightly more. And if you're doing that as part of a diversified portfolio, it's not going to make a huge difference. It's really not going to make a huge difference. So I think this point of advocating for having youth housing in very many of these developments is absolutely A, correct to do, and B, very achievable, because the actual amount of subsidy might just, modify by a very small amount, and the super funds aren't going to care. They're going to go, yep, all of the things I said before, they're pretty agnostic as long as they get the return at the end of the day. So it might be slightly more government top-up, but absolutely worth it.
I do worry that small specialist housing providers are going to get left behind here. We talk about scale and so forth, and I'm concerned that it will become so complex that these small specialist providers will just won't be able to cope. They just won't have the resources there to navigate the system. So I think there needs to be some special support for such organisations to deliver what is incredibly important housing.
But I think that also comes down to partnerships, because BYS doesn't build social and affordable housing, but they can partner with Brisbane Housing Company that does, and we can then say, yep, okay, we're going to dedicate X amount of our stock to youth housing. And I think, but it's getting that notion across, that it's partnership and that this is something that is important to incorporate.
And replicated across the country.
Yes.
And in regional areas.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So thank you. We've got just one last very brief question between everyone and lunch. So in 2 words or less, can we get to 1.2 million affordable rental dwellings delivered by 2029?
Not a chance.
Okay.
What did you ask?
Can we get to the 1.2 million in the 5 years?
Yes.
I'm going to use more than my 2 words and say, whether it's 1.2 or 1.1 or 1, we'll get closer to it if we just get on with it.
That's right. Now, so that was excellent, excellent. I apologize, that was a trick question, because, the point is, I want us all to remember there are political announcements, and then there is building an affordable housing provision system that will endure for decades, as we saw in Carolyn's slide of the overseas models. Okay, so let's keep on the page of, as you said very well, let's get on with it. Keep your focus beyond announceables to plug and play, another great quote. Plug and play, let's get solid models that can provide rental opportunities for Australians in perpetuity. Now, thank you so much for your attendance, and I'd like to direct you to the exhibition precinct for lunch, and then at 1:30 there are 6 concurrent sessions and a think tank session. So details are again in your SGCH NHC conference online. I'm very, very sorry for those of you who submitted questions online that may not have been coming through that we didn't get to, or in the audience, but we will see you again in an hour, and thank you so much for coming to this session. Thank you to our speakers as well. Thank you.